Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Carl Lankowski of Historic Chevy Chase, DC. And on behalf of Historic Chevy Chase, DC and Ward 3 Vision, our partners in this evening's event, a warm welcome. My role tonight has two aspects. First, representing an organization with local history in the title, I'd like to situate what we have done together in the past year against the background of the modern history of our neighborhood. I'll devote about 8 minutes to that task. Secondly, I'll introduce our distinguished panelist who will speak to the ways in which the draft small area plan advances the vision it distills. I'll introduce the panel after my opening remarks. I'll moderate the discussion with the help of our producer, Chaz Cadwell, past president of Historic Chevy Chase, DC and currently ANC commissioner, who will be curating the questions you send us. And please use the Q&A function for that purpose. We will finish at 8:30. After a year of active reflection, Chevy Chase, DC has a draft small area plan prepared by the Office of Planning. Before any other commentary, let us pause for a moment to thank the ANC under Randy Speck's leadership for the foresight to give us the opportunity to reflect systematically about our past and future. And to Erica Nosberg, Heba Agowish, and their colleagues at the Office of Planning, we say thank you for doing your work to help us with this self-examination. We recognize that your job is to stimulate, not orchestrate, a conversation amongst us, and certainly not to impose anything on us. We acknowledge our responsibility to make good use of the challenge we asked you through our ANC to deliver to us. Over the past year, we would like to think we have risen to the occasion with encouragement by old and new civic groups and ANC 4G organizing events and generating commentary that has reverberated through our community. So, what is this plan? First and foremost, it is an occasion for our community to make a statement about its identity. It sends a signal about who we are and how we relate to the rest of our city. What it does not do is equally important to keep in mind. Like all small area plans, this one is not yet a zoning map or a development plan. It is a visioning document that guides DC officials and developers as they consider investment in the small area plan area. The vision is an enhanced, socially inclusive, and environmentally sensitive development in a generational timeframe. The approach is incremental, maintaining the physical environment while opening avenues of improvement to allow us to welcome new neighbors. Speaking for myself, I'd very much like us to embrace and celebrate this vision. Against the background of our history together, this is an important achievement. With that in mind, let me take a few moments about the place of our engagement with the overall area plan in the modern history of Chevy Chase, DC. Since its founding as a streetcar settlement in 1907, this community has never taken the opportunity to articulate what it imagines itself to be. The Chevy Chase Land Company promoted its development as a suburban retreat for the well-to-do, and it was racially exclusionary. The original Citizens Association had a constitution stipulating two membership requirements. You had to be at least 18 years of age and you had to be white. It was consumed with preserving property values thought to be under threat by racial integration. By 1940, all people of color, save for live-in servants and custodial staff in the Connecticut Avenue apartment houses, had been removed. Descendants of Captain George Pointer and other Black families were displaced from the homes they had inhabited since the 1840s on Broad Branch Road so that a whites-only school and park could be built. Okay, fast forward a generation. In 1956, DC became a majority-minority city. White flight amplified the demographic change over the following half generation. In the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination, and the restoration of partial home rule in the mid-1970s, Chevy Chase had begun to come to terms with a changed political environment. Our Citizens Association adjusted to the new reality, and over the next period, quarter century, elected 3 presidents of African American heritage. Notwithstanding, Chevy Chase remains a predominantly white enclave. The 21st century has again seen significant demographic change in DC, with a population increase of 20%, benefiting all of us through increased tax revenue, but also accompanied by pressing issues, particularly an overall housing shortage with acute need in affordable housing, and in the challenge of environmental sustainability. Now, many of our neighbors are well aware of these challenges and would like Chevy Chase DC to be part of their solution. There are handsome rewards for adopting this forward-looking approach. We can assist our neighborhood in overcoming slow stagnation. Our researchers teach us that revitalization of the Connecticut Avenue corridor requires that we address issues like affordable housing and take every opportunity to project a welcoming signal to groups underrepresented in our mix. We embrace diversity because a more diverse Chevy Chase will be a more interesting, vibrant, and desirable place to live and work. The small area plan provides us an opportunity for the first time in this generation to proclaim and project this self-understanding. Okay, all that said, the draft small area plan warrants scrutiny, and many of us have ideas on how to improve it. A challenge many of us have had is that before the draft plan was published 2 weeks ago, the specifics of what we were talking about were all very vague. We hope that our discussion will help us and our neighbors as we prepare comments to the Office of Planning by their May 13th deadline. So this event has been organized first to broadly characterize what the draft small area plan says and what it represents about the aspirations of the community for the coming generation. And second, to raise issues about how to begin achieving the aspirations, focusing on further specification of the design guidelines. So let me introduce tonight's panel. Matt Bell is an award-winning architect and professor of architecture at the University of Maryland, where he leads the urban design curriculum. He also sits on DC's Historic Preservation Review Board. You may be familiar with his recent work at the new Cleveland Park Library, or Collection 14, as in 14th Street, DC, which just won a prestigious Congress for New Urbanism Charter Award. Our second panelist is David Castile. He's a city planner with over 30 years of experience in community organizing, urban planning, housing affordability, homelessness prevention, and community development. He's worked in Chicago, Raleigh, North Carolina, Arlington, Virginia, and currently works for the city of Gaithersburg. His work focuses on leveraging local government finance and land use tools to expand housing affordability. And our third panelist is Ellen McCarthy, our neighbor, who's an urban planner, serving on as the director of DC's Office of Planning. She's on the faculty of the Urban and Regional Planning program at Georgetown University, where she teaches a course on land use controls. And she's the principal of the Urban Partnership. Standing by the way, in the Q&A portion of our discussion is Erica Osberg, who took the lead for the DC Office of Planning and managing the Chevy Chase small area plan. He'll field questions about the process that may arise at that point. So, having introduced the panel, let me turn first to Matt Bell. Matt, talk to us, if you would, about whether this small area plan is the kind of plan that meets the goals we have talked about. Is this a sustainable approach to accommodating growth? Does this look like a plan that would maintain our Main Street character? What do you say?
Let's see here. Oops. Let's get the right screen up here. Hold on. Let me get the right share screen there, Carl, before I answer your question. Here.
That's okay. We will wait.
Hold on 1 second here. Have to get my presentation on the right screen here. Okay. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can, Matt.
Okay, great. Yeah, short answer to your question, Carl, I think it is a good plan. And it's a very good roadmap for the future. And some of the things I like about it are that it.
Matt, can you put your screen to full screen so we don't have to?
Yeah, I
preview
can.
the show.
Hold on 1 second here. Okay, I have to figure out the other screen here. Okay. No, this is not being very cooperative here. Hold on a second.
Well, go with what you can do then.
Yeah, this gets very tricky in PowerPoint. Can you see my screen now? But you can see all the slides, right?
Much better. No, this is perfect.
Okay, so I think one of the things that's nice about the plan is it talks about things comprehensively, and then it makes some specific recommendations, and I think that's very important. So I just wanted to touch on a few things that I think are highlights of the plan that I think are good roadmaps for the future, and some suggestions about how we might think about them as we move forward. They put forward these 6 themes. What is important to realize is that these themes are broad and overarching, but they also have certain kinds of physical ramifications or physical things that go with them that can help enable the strategy. And I think when you look at this 6 themes with the drawing on the right side, where you can see all the different parking lots and some of the opportunity sites that have been outlined, you can see that there is significant opportunity to really build along the corridor in a way that is sensitive to both the commercial history of the corridor, the historic buildings, and also the residential neighborhoods. And certainly some of the goals and the themes do identify very specific things, such as the reimagined civic core, which is very important to the plan, because I think everybody agrees universally that that's something that could really drive the plan in a positive way with new community assets there. The plan talks about different character areas, and I think that's a good roadmap too, because not every place in the plan is the same. It identifies, as I mentioned, the civic core. It's got some very good precedents outlined here for good buildings to model that civic core on. But I think it also identifies the difference in frontage between the east side and the west side, and also the fact that it is a gateway into Washington, D.C., which I think is an important consideration for any new development that goes on in those areas. I just have outlined some of the main urban design ideas in the plan here and tried to highlight some of the text. The ground floor commercial uses fronting onto Connecticut Avenue are encouraged. One of the things you want in any kind of commercial district is you want continuity along the street front. That makes a pleasant walking environment. There are lots of gaps in the smile, teeth missing in the smile in Chevy Chase, and a real opportunity to build a better continuous frontage along the street in a way that encourages people to spend time there. If you've been to any great historic city like Paris or Rome, you know that that's a constituent element of great streets, and making that visual connection is important. Buildings should, of course, be parallel to Connecticut Avenue and define that street wall. That's a good point. The front facade should be at the front property line by and large, and also the building entrance should be at the level of sidewalk. Some of these things may seem obvious, but they need to be stated so that they become a kind of principle moving forward. And in general, I think the idea that residential entries ought to be on the side streets is important, so that the character changes on each of those streets. And I like the idea here that they're promoting social features like stoops and porches to transition to residential uses. Very important, because a lot of the residential buildings come very close to the commercial corridor, so we need to make proper transitions. And of course, we don't want loading and parking in places that are visually obtrusive, and we want to make sure we want to minimize their potential impact. The street wall is important. The plan talks about the basic street wall being no less than 25 feet. Connecticut's a wide street, so having a street wall that actually defines the space of the street is very important. And then, of course, having window displays of modulation along the commercial corridor is very important. You don't want a street wall that's an interior that's too short on a commercial frontage because it doesn't really support good mixed-use buildings. And it is an opportunity to frame the sidewalk and other things that are part of the streetscape should be important to be considered. And they've included some precedents here, which I think are things that are probably pretty good models for what the street could become into the future. There's some specific text about retail and how the retail engages the sidewalk. One of the things we're blessed with in Chevy Chase DC is a pretty wide sidewalk. So lots of things can happen there. There's been a lot of growth of outdoor dining there. There's still room to walk with your friends up and down the street, even though there's been this growth in outdoor dining. And then, of course, one of the things that's most important to realize, and I think this drawing is from the east side looking south, and you can see the bank in the far right. What's most important about making a streetscape is the first couple of floors. Those really have to be defined well to give a good sense of the public realm. And of course, you do need to support retail. You do need rooftops. We need people living there that can patronize the retail areas so that they're thriving retail. Another thing that the plan talks about is building transitions. And I know there's been a lot of discussion in the community about transitioning from the commercial corridor to the residential areas near it. And the plan talks about setbacks and also stepping buildings. So appropriate transitioning and buffering from low density housing east and west of the corridor and using open space to transition. This is also somewhat common in the city zoning code. A building we did that Carl mentioned we won an award for down on 14th Street is an Arts 4 district and it abuts in a residential district. And in that area, you're actually required to step the building back a certain amount from adjacent residential areas. So there is precedent for that in the city to make these proper transitions. The character is very important. And one of the things that goes a long way to defining character, the choice of building materials. Certainly brick is a predominant material in the neighborhood and helps us have a sense of where we are. Using large windows, but also avoiding glass curtain walls is important. And of course, being sustainable in terms of using materials that are recycled or reusing building materials is very, very important. And I think moving forward, as new projects come in, we want them to add to the character of Chevy Chase DC and not introduce something that seems alien. The plan talks about the public realm opportunities, certainly the civic core, but signature design elements in places on facades should be recognized, public art, sculpture and murals, and certainly places like the Walmata site could have markets and other kinds of temporary activities that could activate those locations. And then finally, they've included a couple of drawings here, which I think give you a sense of what the future could be, which I think are very nice. Talking about buildings that go up 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 stories, have some setbacks, interest at the skyline that are sympathetic to the adjacent context on either side, and also drawing a street section of the public realm area along the street that talks about tenant areas and circulation areas, amenity areas. If this is conceived properly and managed well, this could continue to be some place that we all gravitate to, that we all love to be in, whether we have something to do or not, and becomes an even better public realm for the community. So, Carl, that's pretty much what I have to say at this point. And if there are questions later, I'll come back.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's a great statement to get us off and running. Let me turn to David and ask David Christille, what's your view about this plan? Is it the kind of plan that could increase housing options, including affordable housing in Chevy Chase DC?
I think the short answer is yes. And I think the plan does essentially 3 things to do that. It lays out the planning and zoning framework, or potential for zoning framework, that is the foundation for any additional housing that could go. And as the plan suggests, it's mainly along Connecticut Avenue. It provides a menu of the tools. There's the section, the equity section, which talks about the land use and the finance tools that if the plan's adopted and if the land use changes occur, that here's a menu of essentially tools that can be used by property owners or developers to provide more housing, more affordable housing. And then essentially the third part is really up to the community to, if it adopts this plan, embraces this plan, to work with the various stakeholders to make more housing a reality. Carl, I can't hear you.
Carl, you're muted.
I'm sorry. What is this? What is your sense about the timing of this? What kind of time frame do you think would be required to begin to see some of what you're suggesting?
I mean, I think it's really depending on the community. I mean, the word that somebody talked about earlier was evolutionary. And I know I worked in Arlington for 15 years. And from some perspectives, things happen quickly. But my experience there is things really did happen on a project by project basis. And I know one of the first developments that folks are interested in is really the redoing of the community center and library. And that's something that could happen, that could happen relatively soon. And then it is getting the plan adopted. And then after that, it's really essentially it's a market, it's a function of the market in terms of how, the timing of when development would get done and whether that's mixed income, mixed use, but that's really a market question.
I'm sure these are things that we'll come back to in the Q&A. Let me go to Ellen McCarthy and ask her how all of this is supposed to happen. Talk to us about what needs to happen to get the most out of the planning exercise. I think you may have some ideas about how zoning marries up with this process.
Yes, thanks, Carl. I wanted to just briefly set the overview of how things would happen with regard to the plan. Because the whole idea, as you mentioned in your introduction, your whole idea behind a plan is to provide guidance for future development. So for people who are looking at the forum or people who are looking at the document on the Office of Planning website, this is your chance to say what you think new development should look like in order to fit in with the neighborhood. And as you mentioned, the comment period runs until May 13th. But what's important to realize is the plan is not the end of anything. If the plan is adopted by the city council, that still doesn't change the rules for development in our section of Chevy Chase. There would have to be a rezoning because it's the zoning regulations that if there's a recommendation in the plan for the creation of a special zone that is allowed under the zoning regulations, we could have a special zone just for our area of Chevy Chase. And the rezoning could be initiated by the ANC, by the Office of Planning, by community groups. But once that new zoning is in place, then the property owners would be free to pursue redevelopment of their land in conjunction with or in consonance with the zoning regulations. But it's important to realize rezoning doesn't mean any automatic development. In fact, the zoning that's in place now on our commercial district would allow buildings up to 40 feet tall, but there's only one building, the M&T Bank building, that even comes close to that. So anyhow, with that as a context of recognizing that what I'm talking about tonight is what kinds of tools or mechanisms could we put into place to make sure that we get development that is in consonance with the small area plan. And I think for all of the potential tools that we're talking about, it's important to keep in mind that we're trying to get a balance between zoning controls that give us the kind of neighborhood that we want to see as represented in the small area plan, and but not provide such onerous regulations that no developers or no property owners will undertake any development. So we won't achieve the goals that are set out in the plan for getting a diverse variety of housing and getting more affordable units. So there's about 6 possible ways that are already in our zoning code that we could tools that we could use to as part of the rezoning. We could say that development over a certain size could only happen by special exception. So a developer would have to go to the Board of Zoning Adjustment to get them to approve the development. It would give us the power to enforce the guidelines, but the BZA doesn't have a lot of design expertise, and it could discourage developers from doing anything because of the time, the cost, and the risk involved. There's a provision in the regs for design review by the Zoning Commission down on the Anacostia waterfront. The Zoning Commission has more design expertise than the BZA, but those are by and large major projects. So they have the ability to do the kind of consultant work and take the time and risk that would be involved in going through a whole process of design review with the Zoning Commission. As you know, some people have suggested an historic district. And, the advantage of that is if the Historic Preservation Review Board is reviewing projects to see if they are in consonance with the historic district guidelines, they do have a lot of design expertise, but they would only apply consideration as to whether or not the buildings in the future would be in conjunction with the qualities that are outlined in an historic district, and not to see if we are achieving goals in terms of creating more affordable housing or making a livelier retail district by improvements on the storefronts. And in fact, there are some questions as to whether our commercial district could even qualify for historic district designation, since not very many of the buildings are actually very historic. And the two that are seriously historic, the Avalon Theater and the Arcade, are already designated historic landmarks. But for the rest of the area to be an historic district, the historic district requirements can be very stringent in terms of, things like not replacing wooden windows with vinyl windows. And all of that can drive up the costs and could seriously discourage developers from redeveloping along the lines of what we're calling for in the small area plan. Another possibility would be a conservation district, which is sort of like historic district light, which would have some of the same pros and cons of the historic district. The regulation's not quite so stringent, but we don't currently have established the ability to do conservation districts, so that would require a whole legislative change. Lastly, we could just go with a conventional matter of right zone, like MU5, this is what is potentially proposed, which just regulates sort of height and density and lot coverage and the basic things that zoning covers, the normal conventional zoning. But the more that we've thought about it, we think maybe a hybrid model would be the best approach, where we would create, as part of the zoning district, very detailed design guidelines, taking off from the ones that are in the small area plan. But like what is called a form-based code in a lot of other jurisdictions around the country, and what you can see, Columbia Pike in Arlington has form-based zone. So the design guidelines would go a lot further in terms of looking at materials and really codifying, like the stepping down that Matt was talking about. And to make this happen, then we think it would make sense to create an advisory commission of the ANC. Many ANCs in our ward and across the city have subcommittees like planning and zoning committees or something similar. The exact composition of the advisory committee could be determined later, but it would make sense to have maybe a preservationist, a few architects, citizen representatives, probably an ANC member. And the charge to that committee would be to review proposed developments and to determine whether the development adheres to the design guidelines and make a recommendation about their findings to the ANC, which would then review their recommendations, open the discussion to community members. But if everybody agrees that the project is consistent with the design guidelines that are in the zoning, then it could report that support to the Office of Planning, the Public Space Committee that determines what can be put in the sidewalk area, DDOT, which looks at curb cuts and other things. And the writing of the zone itself could then say that the zoning administrator, who's the final determinator, not terminator, but the final determinant about whether a building permit can go forward or not, whether it adheres to the zoning regulations, the zoning administrator could be required to review and give great weight to the recommendations from the ANC and the advisory committee and the office, the ANC and the Office of Planning. It doesn't mean that he would have to, but he would have to show that he had given great weight to those recommendations. And the benefit of that would be we get a community input. We'd still get the ability to create diversity of housing. And we could also offer an incentive to the developer that they would know pretty much what are the detailed design guidelines ahead of time. And if they conform to the design guidelines that would be in the zoning, the DDOT could agree to expedite curb cut approvals, or the Public Space Committee could expedite the public space permits. There could be rewards for them complying with the small area plan and the zoning. So those were just some quick ideas about how we can make sure that the kind of goals and objectives and designs that are laid out in the plan, that we could actually see them come to life in the future.
Thank you. That was an amazing tour, horizon of what may be possible. At this stage, before we get into the Q&A, I'd like to invite our other panelists, Matt and David, to react to what you just said. Matt, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I thought it was all brilliant, but I mean, it's
I don't pay him.
Yeah, that's true. One of the concerns I've heard people, say is, yes, we're interested in development, but we want good development. We want to make sure that it's compatible with our neighborhood. We certainly believe that housing is something that is possible here. And, I think this question of review, design review is an important one, because it's a nice place. I think this plan wants to make it an even nicer place. I do think the different levels of review that Ellen has rolled out in different ways to think about it are really important discussions to have. The one that I happen to like best is the last one, this sort of hybrid model where you have design professionals advising the ANC, and that could have some teeth in terms of whether somebody gets an approval or not. But I have to say that in my experience, getting projects in front of the Zoning Commission and the Historic Preservation Review Board and the zone and the BZA, they almost always get better after professionals look at them and weigh in and ask hard questions about things. So I do think crafting the right way of reviewing projects, something that works for Chevy Chase DC would really be a good idea.
David?
And then on the affordable piece, it's again, it's setting, this, all of what Ellen talked about is really setting the framework for how development would happen. And so the affordability really depends on what the community wants and what the market's going to get. And then, and it's, making sure that whenever, as those processes have timing, there's also the financial tools and that need to be factored into that. Tax credit schedules, schedules for the Housing Production Trust Fund, all these other tools that make affordable housing work, those are ones that would have to be factored into any kind of process. I know, it was interesting. We worked on the Columbia Pike form-based code, and that was, you know, because there were advocates there and housing people there, you know, that the affordability was wired into that neighborhoods-based form-based code, and so that was a, you know, that made it kind of easy for us, whether it's through the land use process and advising the staff on how to, you know, in terms of what sort of units we wanted within developments that were approved by the form-based code, or if they wanted more affordability, you know, what trust fund monies are used, how does that relate to the tax credit schedule and all that. So I think it's really, I mean, I think it's easy for the affordable housing tools to work, you know, in really whatever setting it's done. But I think it just needs to make sure that you're intentional about making sure that housing is part of that conversation. As I'm kind of remembering, I know one of the things that we felt in Arlington, at least, is that the land use planning along the metro stations pretty well, but they really left out housing, and we ended up playing catch up in the mid 2000s and beyond, because housing really wasn't at the table at the beginning. Whereas in this case, with this particular small area plan draft, it's pretty clear that housing's at the table, so that whatever ways to incentivize housing, those can be part of the process.
So what would you think is the you know, single biggest hurdle that Chevy Chase DC would have to face starting now in order to see some affordable housing in the foreseeable future?
I mean, the hurdle is really getting, you know, it's a combination of, you know, getting the land use and zoning lined up that accommodates a level of density that can be financially feasible. And that's true for affordable housing or market rate housing. And then once that happens, then it really is in the community in terms of what kind of affordable housing do people want? Do they want mixed income housing? Do they want all income restricted? If they want it mixed, you know, what's the market portion going to look like? How does that get financed? What's the affordable portion going to look like? How is that financed? Or is it just inclusionary zoning? Those kinds of questions. I don't think they're hurdles. It just makes it more complicated, because like any development or redevelopment, whether it's mixed use or market rate, there's a number of stakeholders and parties that have to all align for something to be successful. Affordable housing just adds another set of layers to that complexity of development in a process.
Chaz Cadwell has been monitoring the Q&A in the chat, and we should turn to some of the questions that are coming up there. Chaz?
Sure, and I thank you, Carl. I've been taking notes, and you guys have addressed several of the questions, but I'll start with a more general one. That is, you've talked about some very specific things like a form-based code or different levels of affordability, et cetera. And one of the concerns that's been expressed since the very beginning here by neighbors is that it's all pretty vague and not clear what constrains what. And so we have the draft plan now, which is we've had for a month, I guess. And it's got a set of recommendations. It's got some design principles. It's got some design guidelines. But I'm not sure, can one of you who know more about design planning than most of us, what's the effect of those, if anything, on actual development? Or do any of those have to be turned into a zoning rule or something else before they have any teeth?
I'm not sure what that
Well,
means.
one of the concerns is that they will end up looking like Bethesda, right? And so there's some good language in here about the design guidelines and design principles and recommendations that align with what OP heard from the community, I think. But how those and so those may get turned into rules, but what assures people that they will be? Or where do people get to keep track of what goes on once the SAP is adopted?
Well, that's why I was saying that the plan is only the first step. And then when a zone is created, that's a very public process. It has to be posted. The office, the zoning commission hears testimony from anyone who wants to comment. And only after they've heard everybody do they then make do they adopt a zone that would apply to the area.
And so
So
I
that's it.
see.
the form-based code that you were mentioning, is that doable within the existing DC apparatus, or is that requires some new legislation or anything?
No, we already have a form-based code that was applied to the Hill East area where St. Elizabeth's is by the Stadium Armory. In fact, Matt Bell was the one who devised the regulating plan that that zone was based on. So we already have a model, and we have similar kinds of models that have been developed for Walter Reed, St. Elizabeth's, are in process for the Armed Forces Retirement Home, although those are, brand new developments. But the Hill East one set out a set of guidelines depending on the type of street that they were on to make
And
them
it's being
consistent.
built now. You can go over
Right.
there and take a look. It's actually being built.
Right.
Right.
So,
Finally.
so is there a reason that should something like that be mentioned or talked about in an SAP or not?
Well, just to jump in here, Columbia Pike has a form-based code. We're working over there right now. And the idea behind a form-based code is that everything's set out in advance. And if you conform to the form-based code, you get a building permit. That's the idea. It's designed to kind of eliminate, and it's designed to set the vision up front. So the style of the buildings and the character of them and the heights and the pitches of the roofs and the materials and things are all worked out ahead of time. And then if the developer comes in with a project that adheres to all of those conditions in the form-based code, they get a building permit and they don't have to go to a review process. And I think the way it works in Columbia Pike is if they want to deviate from it, then they have to go to the planning board and get a review and approval. I think that's right, David. You would know more than I would about Columbia Pike. But so the idea is there to minimize the bureaucracy. There's been some number of questions about whether or not a review panel would be mandatory or advisory. I think at this point, it would be up to the community to weigh in on what their preference would be on that. Advisory tends not to have the teeth that a mandatory review, thumbs up or thumbs down, has. And I think people should weigh in on what they feel is the right thing for Chevy Chase. I think if a historic building, if a building historic district comes before us among the Historic Preservation Review Board and we don't approve it, it doesn't get built. So there is teeth in that manner. So I think what Ellen has been suggesting is something that has the same sort of potential for that in Chevy Chase, but maybe not a historic preservation district, but something that might have the same level of review might be one option.
Yeah, and again, I guess my point of this is, or my comment on this is, it's always, and this is something that, at least from a staff perspective, we were competing, we as staff that financed affordable housing, the developers we work with were always competing with the market. And so I don't know I'm not sure how to sort of hardwire that, but for cases, like the library in the commercial, the community center, where it's a city-owned property and the city has control, and they can, they have a lot of say in what happens with that. Whereas, picking on, say, the Safeway site or the Exxon, the gas station, or I guess it's the building that has the Chase Bank, these properties along the eastern part of Connecticut Avenue, which would be good potential housing sites, unless there's control over the land, when that, whoever the seller is or developer, or the seller, that they're going to have to, if there's an affordable housing developer that wants to do it, they're going to have to compete with with market rate developers to make that happen. I think the one way to do it, at least, is through the plan. And if the plan has a strong statement that this is the kind of housing we want, and we're going to be really supportive of this. I think that'll encourage the developers that you might want that, that are really talented in this city or this region to come in and put forward proposals. If I could share my screen, there's a really interesting development that's
Sure, go ahead.
14th Street. And I'm sorry for missing the cue on this. Whoops. So what I wanted to share on this screen is, this is a screen to really talk about the tools that are talked about in the plan, the inclusionary zoning and IZ plus, which if you go through that, if you get that, it's for any development that's more than 10 units. And it's anywhere from 8 to 20% of the GFA is for affordable housing. The HANTA, which is a tax abatement program that's relatively new, you have to have 33% of the GFA that's affordable homes. The Housing Production Housing Production Trust Fund is the city's loan fund. The current budget is $500 million for this year, so that's a lot of money. It hasn't been used in Ward 3 except now the Listener Homes got an award, so that's really great. LIHTC and bonds, these are tax credit, low-income housing tax credits and bonds. This is another financing mechanism that also helps affordability. And then the HPAP is the district's homeownership assistance program, which is a loan program that helps low and moderate income people purchase their homes. But what I want to talk about is this development on 14th Street. This is between, it's on 14th. I'm not sure what block it's on, but you're looking at the 5-story building that's to the right of the screen. And this is a partnership between a developer, Helios, and the Dance Works studio over on 14th Street. It's mixed use, mixed income. It's got retail space on the ground floor, a dance studio, a black box theater. It's got 101 units, and of those 101 units, 67 are affordable income restricted. And the affordability is ranging from anywhere from $25,000, people that earn $25,000 up to about $90,000. They're 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. So it's a really good example of what could happen, on the Chevy Chase part of Connecticut Avenue.
So David, in that example, though, that was a private developer who patched together different incentive schemes and what they thought the market would bear, who they could attract to that particular spot.
Yep, that's correct. And it's, you don't see too many partnerships like that, but I think at least especially in the housing sector, you do see partnerships where you've got a for-profit developer that knows the market, that does the bigger part of the deal. And then you've got, sometimes they bring in a nonprofit partner to do the affordable component of that. And I've seen a lot of that. Again, an example in Arlington is where Bizzuto partnered with the Wesley Housing Development Corporation. It was a mixed income development. Bizzuto did the market rate piece. I think it was 40% of the units were market rate. And then, I'm sorry, 60% of the units were market rate. And then 40% were income restricted, and the units were spread throughout the building. It was a fairly large development. But those kinds of partnerships are the things that can add affordability in this plan. I guess the question is, how do you incentivize those kinds of partnerships is something perhaps in the future, or as this plan goes through the draft stage to try to figure out how to do that.
Those of you on the panel have as much access to the Q&A in the chat as I do, but I'm going to push ahead unless one of you wants to jump in and grab one of these questions. The question that I do have is the plan talks about coordination with DDOT and the schools, districts, et cetera, but there's very little here about the sort of the overall community planning, and yet the whole, the community doesn't develop one sector at a time. And so this is the city's small area plan, not just the Office of Planning's. And so I know there's some concerns that, this doesn't say much about parking. The Connecticut Avenue reversible lane study stops at Legation Street. And so the bike lanes that are envisioned there, will dump people into the bus lane as they hit that street light. And so my question is, and I don't know the full range of SAPs across the city, but is it reasonable to have hoped that this would have more detail about what what the future planning efforts are in these other agencies. So we have a more integrated vision of what Chevy Chase would look like. And if not, where does that happen? Or just by accident?
I mean, one example of where it happens, and again, it's an easy target because it's DC owned land, is a community center and library. That's, you know, the city. They've got a park facility, they've got the community center there. And so it's hopefully not necessarily seamless, but with the community, they can work with the Office of Planning, they can work with DEMPED, they can work with the Department of Housing and Community Development and other agencies that, together can put together a pretty good request for proposals that developers can apply for.
Right, I understand that. I guess what I'm thinking is a lot of work went into the small area plan. It's thinking about the demographics and the form and the look of the streetscape, but there are people in that as well. And, I'm on the advisory committee for the Connecticut Avenue corridor thing. We were talking yesterday about curb cuts for gas stations and parking lots and all sorts of things that, should integrate with this sort of thing very dramatically, and yet they don't. And so I don't know where looking ahead where that happens.
It's a good question, because what the plan is good at is a vision and some guiding principles for further development. And how that happens, I mean, what Ellen talked about in terms of what is the implementation, what are the control mechanisms are going to be important, what is DDOT doing? There are a number of, but there's only one real public site, which is the community center and the library. Everything else is privately held. So what has to happen?
Streets and the sidewalks too.
Well, yeah, right. But in terms of development, so the next step in terms of figuring out how to control and put the controls in place for the private development so that the community gets what they want seems to me to be a logical next step. And how that works with a regulatory process that works for Chevy Chase. There is an interesting thing though. You mentioned, Chaz, parking, and some people have mentioned parking in the chat. Parking's important for retailers, but one of the reasons why suburban areas build big parking lots is because they don't have any walkable neighborhoods near the retail. So the only way people can get there is by the car. So one thing to think about is if you want good retail, you have to have more people living in the area that can patronize those things. And I think vertical mixed use is one way to do that. I will say as well, in DC is unique nationally because it has a very interesting incentive to put parking underground, which is that in terms of your floor area ratio, your FAR, in DC, unlike a lot of cities, all of the development above grade counts towards the allowable developable square footage. In many cities, they exclude the parking. So that's why in Baltimore and in other places, you see these 8-story parking decks above ground. But in DC, that counts against what you can develop. So what it tends to do is it tends to force the parking underground. Now, that can drive the cost of development up. But one of the things we're seeing recently in the city is that in projects where there is, a substantial good amount of development, they're building less parking. Because if it's walkable and there are amenities in the neighborhood and access to transit, developers are finding it just doesn't pencil to build 3 levels of underground parking, and they're going to like 1 level. And the city is requiring less and less residential parking there. Now, residents could say, well, they'll park in the neighborhood. There are ways that projects can be done where the residents don't get a residential parking sticker. And if they want to park, they have to park in the building. And they don't park in the neighborhood. The Babes Billiards project up in Tenleytown was a famous example of that, where the community negotiated with the developer to say, look, we just don't want people parking in the neighborhood. And he said, fine, because it didn't make any financial sense for him to build it anyhow. So, there are a lot of...
One of the aspects of this small area plan, of course, is that it's a very limited area. It's the block each side of the avenue, and yet people using it come from a much wider area. So there's 2 things about that. One is things like parking matter, particularly since our demographics are tending to gray hair like mine. and people who may not be so mobile, that as nice a day as it is, can't walk all the way across, up and down McKinley Street to Connecticut Avenue. But also in the plan, there's a recommendation 4.7 talks about other land use plans outside the small area plan area for the next comprehensive plan, wherever that is. But it's a suggestion of the sort of this is a neighborhood that the whole neighborhood will develop at some point. And it's not clear, does that mean there's a concrete plan, there's a 4.7.1 that describes those land use ideas? And we should be asking.
Yeah, where's Erkin? Erkin.
Yeah, where's Erkin?
Somebody find Erkin.
Not hearing from Erkin, we've got about a minute and a half left before we have to suspend our operation.
Oh my goodness, okay.
Oh, wait, here's
Erkin
Erkin.
just arrived here.
Erkin?
Yeah, hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat the question?
The question is, recommendation 4.7 talks about future different land use rules for the area outside the small area plan. That wasn't written by accident. What are you talking about?
Yeah, so throughout the process, I think what we heard, and I think what was somewhat discussed tonight, is the land use change that we're focusing on along Connecticut Avenue itself, along those 4 blocks, is fairly limited in terms of geography, and also in terms of the change that was made in the comprehensive plan. It was a modest increase in the land use intensity, and so there's only so much that can and will happen and along that area, and that's fine. Throughout our process over the last year, we've heard a lot of questions and comments about additional opportunities for more home ownership in the neighborhood, and other ways to make ownership more accessible. As I think many of the folks in this panel and on the audio are aware, that housing's very expensive. Single family detached housing is very expensive in this neighborhood, and a lot of that's driven by the land value. So not the building, but the land itself that the building is on. And so for that to be more accessible and more attainable to a greater number of people in the future, more homes on that land would need to be possible. Now, that wasn't part of our comprehensive plan change in the last year. That wasn't part of what the small area plan was looking at, but we were asked and are continuously asked to look at all the different ways that we can try to address our housing crisis for all levels of income. And that would be one thing to explore in our next comprehensive plan process, not just in Chevy Chase, but in other places. And I think the challenges that we're really exploring and seeing here are telling us that that's something we need to think about moving forward.
Well, I think we've had a tremendous discussion. There's much more that could be said. Of course, it's been enlightening. It's been very rich, but we've run out of time. So let me offer my heartfelt thanks to our panelists and production team and co-sponsors Ward 3 Vision and Stark Chevy Chase DC for making this event possible. Modern Chevy Chase was the brainchild of an heir to a great fortune 130 years ago. Today, we have the opportunity to reimagine our neighborhood, defining its values and aspirations for the next generation. We have organized this and other events in the hope that our neighbors will participate in the process by giving their comments to the DC Office of Planning by its deadline of May 13th. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.